Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very warm welcome to this special Israeli Apartheid Week broadcast here on Salam Media. I'm the special host presenter for this evening, Ibrahim Musa from the Palestine Solidarity or Palestine Information Network, PIN, based here in Johannesburg, and in your company for the next 60 minutes for a panel discussion on the subject of South African eyewitnesses to Israeli apartheid. Now, we are going to be joined over the next hour and parts of the hour by various personalities from across the solidarity space here in South Africa. And the idea between or behind this particular broadcast is for people to share their experiences, exchange their perspectives on what is lived apartheid, what is the lived experience for apartheid as they have seen it as South Africans, and how has this initiated greater solidarity with the Palestinians and also enhanced their sense of solidarity with the Palestinians. I've got with me this particular very handy guide on Israeli Apartheid, a beginner's guide by the journalist Ben White. And when he talks about defining apartheid, he says that for the purpose of the convention, and he's quoting here from the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, that is attached to the UN General Assembly Resolution 3068 of the 30th of November 1973. The convention says that the crime of apartheid shall include similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination as practiced in Southern Africa, and shall apply to the following inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. The point of a definition like that is that while apartheid was something that has become synonymous with the nationalist rule, the Afrikaner nationalist rule in South Africa, apartheid has a much wider applicability that is defined in international law, which makes it a case that apartheid can be practiced and can be existent anywhere in the world, including Palestine or any other place for that matter. Now, on the one hand, you have the formal definition of apartheid, but on the other hand, we have the lived experiences of apartheid, which obviously conform to that definition. But I think the power of the narrative very often, really outweighs legal arguments, really outweighs the legalese or any kind of technical discussion about apartheid. And therefore, during this special sitting here on Salam Media during Israeli Apartheid Week, we want to bring on a number of South Africans who have a background, who understand what apartheid was in South Africa, and going to Palestine, how were they able to enhance their understanding of apartheid through their lived experiences with the Palestinians. Joining us for this particular panel is going to be Fatima Gabru, the founding activist of the University of Johannesburg Palestine Solidarity Forum. We've got also based in South Africa, studying in South Africa at the moment, Iskandar Abbasi. He's a Palestinian who was raised in the United States of America. And we will have with us as well, joining us on the line is Saida Essop, who is a Palestine Solidarity activist herself, who spent 3 months in Palestine in 2019. Let's welcome our panel for this evening, and to you, Fatima, to you, Saida, as well as Iskandar. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to all of you.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. I do hope that we're going to be having a very fascinating conversation, to be able to put names, to be able to be putting emotions, raw experiences to the fore when we talk about apartheid, and how does all these collective lived experiences allow us to shape our solidarity more meaningfully going forward. Let's get a bit of a background on how we've merged the South African with the Palestinian through your experiences. Firstly, Fatima Gabru, you are, as we mentioned there, the founding activist of the University of Johannesburg Palestine Solidarity Forum. But besides that, you spend time in the occupied territories very early on in the second Intifada. You want to give us a bit of background of how did that come about and where did you feature?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Stephen. I went to Palestine based on a presentation from a fellow activist, South African apartheid activist, and what she said resonated very deeply within me. And I made means to actually get to Palestine in 2003 and spend time as a long-term volunteer with the International Women's Peace Service. They're based in the region of the Southeast. And over 3 different periods, I spent up to 6 months on the ground in occupied Palestine. And yeah, it was definitely life-changing. And for myself, as an older South African who actually lived and experienced apartheid, there were many deja vu moments there, definitely. Yeah, so that's how I actually got to Palestine in the first place.
And is there obviously a big difference, Fatima, from the time or from your perceptions of what apartheid is, that textbook definition, the understanding that is usually shaped by the South African experience, and how you emerged from that experience in the occupied territories?
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of residences. The first time when I experienced the checkpoint, it was just a friend, the fellow activist, the one who actually inspired me to get to Palestine and to work with the International Peace Service. She collected me at North Ramallah and went through the first checkpoint between Ramallah and North Jerusalem, which is now called horribly, it's been renamed by the settlers and they call it Atara, but it's actually Hawara checkpoint. And I went through there, and at that time it was just a little shanty in the sand. And I actually broke down crying at that point because there was this horrible, horrible feature that came to, I saw it many more times after that. It was this power of an 18-year-old to dehumanize and to undignify and to be insult Palestinians based on the fact that they have this supremacist belief ingrained in them and that they have a gun in their hand, that they have all the power in their hand. And for me, it brought back many memories of apartheid police invading. I mean, I lived through the violent times of the 80s and 90s, and I was actually at university in the 80s when they used to invade campuses and how horribly violent they used to come in there. And I mean, at that time, we used to lead other means. I mean, I'm Indian, so we didn't experience that kind of severe violence that the townships were experiencing. But the same kind of power that the apartheid police had in those days, I saw it, and unfortunately, it's actually been the bar has been lowered in terms of what it's just evil. And yeah, so many times that I actually, in my experiences at checkpoints, at going through at demonstrations, at protests, and you see how these 18-year-olds with guns have so much power to just completely humiliate the Palestinians on the ground. So yes, it's for myself in the party I wasn't very active, and it was something that I actually committed, but it was also the circumstances within the family and growing up within a conservative, protective family. So when actually apartheid, when the opportunity came to me to actually stand up for Palestine, I did. And alhamdulillah, it was opened the path to me to actually go and experience what Palestinians were experiencing. I remember also the fact that my name is Fatima, and every time I went through a checkpoint, there was this first disbelief that, because I have a brown skin as well, that I might be Palestinian as well. Before they saw my South African passport, they would certainly be very rude to me. And I would experience quite a bit of the indignities that many Palestinians experience at checkpoints. So it was endless. It was constantly there that apartheid has been preceded by this horrible. I mean, apartheid is bad enough. It was horrible. It was an evil. It is a monstrosity. And to find that there's a current system in the world that actually has used the sort of template of apartheid and then made it even more evil than it actually was, and it still exists. yeah, for me it was horrible to experience that part of it. But it was also an honor to stand amongst Palestinians, to see them resist and to stand up and to know the history and to constantly talk about the history and to constantly assert their right to be on the indigenous land. So yeah, it's a lot of moments where apartheid South Africa came to my mind, and also yeah.
We'll obviously explore that parallel that has often been drawn between South Africa and Palestine and the depth to which that goes. And we would cite obviously people like the likes of Desmond Tutu or Wandli Makanya and so many other South Africans who made that trip and were able to draw parallels or be able to draw conclusions on that. I want to switch for a moment here to Iskandar. And as I mentioned at the beginning or in our private discussion, your perspective kind of changes. It's not exactly a South African who's gone to Palestine, but it's a Palestinian who's come to South Africa. But again, that South African element features in your story. And how would you then, or perhaps let's start off before we get any analytical. Just tell us a bit about your own personal journey as a Palestinian coming to South Africa and how this perhaps also is a manifestation of apartheid.
Sure. Assalamu alaikum, Dumelang, Sani Bunani, to all of our viewers in South Africa and elsewhere. Shukran to you, Ibrahim, and to Salam Media for the invitation. Where to begin? I feel like a lot of my life has been defined by something called apartheid. I'm born and raised in the United States of Palestinian ancestry. My family is traditionally from Al-Quds, Jerusalem. And my grandfather, who was born and raised there, fought against Zionist militias prior to 1948. My family was eventually, in effect, displaced, forced to move, and most of the family grew up in Lebanon. And if anyone knows anything about Palestinian refugees, whether in the Arab world or elsewhere, apartheid followed them into those places. So to this day, I mean, the majority of Palestinians who ended up as refugees in a place like Lebanon or Syria or other places, they don't have formal citizenship. So they are treated with this separateness. In terms of my experience, the United States, also there, I mean, an extremely, if we're talking about the big 3 or 4 apartheid states in history, I mean, you're going to have to put the United States of America number 1, many of the countries in Europe as well, South Africa, apartheid South Africa, of course, and then we have Israel. So in the United States, although different movements, civil rights and human rights liberation movements, primarily in the 60s and 70s, terminated de jure or legal apartheid to an extent. There are many ways, like in South Africa, post 94, apartheid has continued. So my own personal family, I can say in the 80s, whether it's having an uncle who was deported, nearly deported, for simply showing up to an immigration center trying to renew his visa, or it was my family being wiretapped during the Kuwait War, or many of the racist experiences we had growing up, whether it's with the police or in schools or elsewhere. Apartheid followed us there. And I've been in South Africa now about 7 to 8 years. I came here to study, and alhamdulillah, I've really learned a lot from your people's history. And I think that when we talk about something like apartheid, there are general ways people can understand and relate to it. And then there are more specific ways, there are similarities and differences. So, I mean, in the largest sense, as I think that you shared in the beginning, Ibrahim, apartheid means in Afrikaans separateness, okay? And prior to 1948, that had a certain history. But for whatever reason, 1948, it took on a more technical meaning, which meant legal apartheid based on race in South Africa. Ironically, 1948 is also the year that the state of Israel was created. And in many ways, you have the beginning, or actually the continuation. I mean, I think South Africans know the British well. The British were also in Ottoman Palestine and colonized Palestine first, and then handed it over to the Zionist movement. So there are many, many similarities to the way that these systems came about. But what does it mean personally? I mean, if you're a Palestinian who grows up anywhere, if we're just talking about historic Palestine, okay, let's say you're a Palestinian growing up in Haifa, which is in Israel proper, okay, the legal jurisdiction of this colonial occupier, in which most Israeli Arabs, that's what they call Palestinians, face over 50 laws discriminating them simply based on the fact of their Palestinian ethnicity, race, and heritage. Most of the Palestinian communities, though not all, I mean, they have been ghettoized, just like in South Africa when they created the Bantustans. Okay, in Israel proper, what Palestinians call 48 Palestine, you're sanctioned off in society economically. You're forced to live in poverty. You're forced to not be allowed to work in certain industries. You're forced under suspicion in so many different ways. If we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza, there's a lot of other experiences there. Like Comrade Fatima was mentioning, there are many similarities to the way that the occupation in those places is very similar to what happened in South Africa. There are some key differences, though. For one, you didn't have a continuous strong movement of white settlers coming to continuously colonize South Africa in the same way that it's happened with Palestine. You didn't have the same extent of military occupation and walls and kind of quantifiable apartheid, meaning penetrating so many aspects of life through technology and the military. And being in South Africa for 7-8 years now, I mean, there are many things I think Palestinians can learn from the anti-apartheid struggle here and experience of apartheid. I mean, since '94, okay, official legal apartheid ended, but of course there are many problems left with that legacy. Yeah.
Come to South Africa, and as you've benefited from person-to-person interactions with South Africa, also economic, or rather academic interactions with fellow South Africans, and how that solidarity has evolved over these years, and how these kind of experiences, shared experiences, meetings between South Africans, strategizings between South Africans and Palestinians, perhaps has improved and can still improve that relationship. I want to go return to Fatima and ask you, Fatima, about the fact that you were there at the height of the second Intifada, what was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and does that give you perhaps a much more enhanced understanding of really how violent this could get, how serious apartheid manifestations could get in Palestine versus what we had in South Africa? And if you reflect on that and the experience of people who go to Palestine, then perhaps 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, who see a different brand of apartheid, what would the differences be there in those different eras, seeing the different faces of apartheid?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, the face of what I saw in Palestine changed from 2003 to 2006, 7 when I last went. Significant for the 2003 visit was the closed in. There was many physical checkpoints and blockages around villages, and I experienced many of those. To get to a village that was just next door to us, we had to go through 2 or 3 stops. So you stop at one and there's a big mound of sand, and you cannot, no car or no, people have to walk over so you get to another vehicle. Definitely experienced the tightness of it. And flying checkpoints was a significant part of the the occupation at that point. You could be driving. It was a terrible time of uncertainty. I mean, it hasn't changed. It wasn't. It was bad. But there, you could any time of the day or night they would invade homes and places, and that was also why we went as international women's peace service to stay in the village of Haris, because there the village itself had been sort of experiencing the height of the occupation and the violence there. I mean, they used to come in at 10, 11 o'clock, invade the village, pull all the men out, line them up outside, put a lot of them down on the floor, put those little cuffs on their hands, the plastic things, and it just keep them there until 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And this used to be a regular occurrence in the village of Haris and many other villages around occupied Palestine. And please don't refer to it as Palestinian territories because they're not territories, it's occupied Palestine. So it was a very heightened time. So, and especially when I went from 2003 and I was when I went again in 2004, I was much more tense and nervous. And people had to actually speak to me and say, okay, it's not as bad as the first time you came around. We can do a bit more, even as international activists. We could intervene on a much more forthright sort of manner than we actually were able to do in 2003. Also, the biggest change that I actually see, so that was also like, even anything that got better. I know in 2003 I went to a protest in the suburb of Aram, which is the north of Jerusalem, which is the part where the Hawara checkpoint is. And we were actually part of a protest where the Palestinians were protesting against the wall going to be built. And in that time, between 2003 and 2007, the wall got built. Every time I went, there was a different route to get to actually the Palestinian buses and to get to the northern parts of Palestine. So for me, the biggest part was, yes, it was much more violent, much more closed up in 2003. It heightened your sense of, it just gave you a very, very keen sense of how horrible military occupation is. It was slightly easing up at the time of 2004, but while the Palestinian land had gotten smaller because of many of the colonial invasions into towns, into villages, into village lands as such. They slightly opened up a few more of those checkpoints were opened up. It wasn't so difficult to get between one. Like even our village of Haris, from the first time when I arrived there, you just get picked, you get dropped off at the end of the village because there was a huge mound there. They put it there so no cars could get into the village. And you had to walk over and then you find your way and you walk around and we actually had to get to where we were actually stationed. By the time I got there in 2004, the mount was taken away so we could actually walk in. And in 2006, there wasn't any sign of that kind of mounds or checkpoints or blockages in the villages. But they were starting to fence in the villages. This occupation is very, very, it's very invasive. On the one point, it gives a little and it takes a whole lot more on the other side. And it's constantly doing this. So yeah, from 2003 to 2006, it was like so many things that I had to compare, so many things I had to experience changing. It's just horrifying to see so much. For me, the only word that came to mind and that still comes to mind when I think of the occupation is how evil it is, how insidious it is, how it creeps and how it's like an evil animal that just wraps its fangs around the Palestinians, making their lives as difficult as possible so that they voluntarily want to move away or that they just wither away. And young people just, I've seen many of the young people that I got to know there. They move away because life is so dead end in the occupied Palestine. And they go away to Europe, they go away to the US, they go to the various forest communities that Iskandar is speaking about. So it's very upsetting for me to talk about Palestine. It's very to show the differences that I experienced in that time. Yeah.
Iskandar, if I could go back to this evolution that Fatima speaks about there, how apartheid still exists, the objectives of occupation are still existing, which is maximum increasing the foothold over Palestinian land, maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians within it. And this is occurring steadily, but just taking different guises. And does that not point to a shortcoming in the way the Palestinian story is sometimes understood in the world, where people would look at what is occurring, at a particular intifada or a particular war that breaks out, but people then lose track of the fact that this strain of Israeli apartheid is continuing nonetheless through various real or manufactured crises along the way.
No, definitely, Ibrahim. It's apartheid is it's in certain ways it's a static idea in lived reality, but in other ways it's always evolving. So if you look at the progression in historical Palestine, okay, we can go back to the British first colonizing in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they first are just kind of getting boots on the ground and in certain ways facilitating the Zionist movement also getting itself on the ground. Now it gets to the point by 1948 where in the broader global moment of decolonization in which these colonized peoples and nations are throwing off the former European powers, Britain can no longer stay there. But the Zionist movement is there and they're ready to take over. So the Zionist movement takes over in 1948, and that is when they start the process of ethnically cleansing, up to 1 million, if not more, Palestinians from their land. So 1948 is a big push. It's the formal institutionalization of apartheid in Palestine. In Hebrew, the term is hafrada for apartheid, which means literally separateness. They used it in their legal policy for putting up walls, for putting up fences, for checkpoints. So you can say, okay, it's in 1948. This is one massive move that apartheid took to evolve. You get to the 67 war, that's another big way that apartheid began to evolve. The formal annexation of the West Bank and Gaza, which had previously been under the administration of Transjordan and Egypt. Okay, but let's fast forward a bit. Okay, we get to the 90s and the so-called Oslo Accords and the peace process, and the Palestinian leadership, for their own reasons at that time, said we are going to make a deal. But in effect, what that deal did is legally entrench apartheid more. Okay, so now, whereas previously they were allowed the right to be militant, the Palestinians in their resistance, and to have autonomy from the Israeli occupiers, they enshrined in this process a treaty that made Israel the eternal big brother. Okay, we get to the second intifada, which Comrade Fatima was sharing a bit about, and you have a further entrenchment as a result of Palestinian resistance. We've always been there, and we will continue to be there, and inshallah, one day we will end the system of apartheid. But there's always going to be this battle between us continuing to resist and the powers that be re-entrenching themselves. Okay, so even at that time, you had a soft border. You didn't have one with Gaza, and there were Israeli settlements inside Gaza. Okay, once Hamas takes over Gaza, and there's a dispute between the PLO and Hamas in 2006, the removal of Israeli settlements. Gaza is kind of the apartheid experiment box, if we can say. If you really want to look at comparative systems of apartheid, whether South Africa, the United States, ongoing apartheid in Kashmir, in the Western Sahara, but Gaza is really like an experimental apartheid box. Complete air, land, sea blockade, continuously turning off and on electricity. You never know when you're getting bombed. You never know when food is coming in and out. in the West Bank. All right, so the walls go up and the checkpoints increase, and the Israeli state continues to use its puppets within the Palestinian resistance movement to further entrench apartheid. So yeah, I mean, apartheid in many ways it's same thing, different day, but in other ways it's continuously getting worse. In other ways, we're also continuing to resist, and I think in certain ways, the way apartheid becomes more evil and becomes more deeply entrenched, it's actually a sign that things might be getting closer to the end. I mean, it's just at this point in time, there is no one, whether you're being politically or correct, on the standards of the West or those that support Israel. It's a sham to talk about the two-state solution practically. That was already an apartheid solution, but now because Palestinians have continued to either be complicit or resist, and the forces are continuing to clash, you can see how are we going to move towards a two-state. Look at all the settlements in the West Bank. Look at all the ways life is controlled from. I mean, if we looked at Nabi Isa alayhi salam, and he was still alive today, and he's trying to minister between Bethlehem, Bethlehem, and Al-Quds, Jerusalem. I mean, him and his disciples and donkey are going to be stopped and frisked, stopped at a checkpoint. You can't know if you're going to show up the next day back home to preach the word. I mean, it's unsustainable, even as it's getting worse. So it's weird, I mean, to try and understand, because it's very disheartening in certain ways. But in other ways, I think there's a bit of hope to see that, look, this is actually like in apartheid South Africa. This is not a sustainable system. And literally, we're going to burn ourselves to the ground, or we're going to have to find a solution to this.
Iskandar, thank you so much for those powerful thoughts and reflections. Just to remind people joining us this evening, this is special Israeli Apartheid Week broadcast on Salam Media. It's Salam Media bringing you South African eyewitnesses to Israeli apartheid. Iskandar Abbasi is probably somebody beyond that characterization, but with wearing a South African cap as well this evening, and a nice BDS T-shirt as well. He is a Palestinian raised in the United States of South Africa, Palestinian raised in the United States, and is currently studying in South Africa for the past few years. Fatima Gabru is a founding activist of the University of Johannesburg Palestine Solidarity Forum, and we are also joined on the line now for a few minutes by Saida Essop. She's a Palestine Solidarity activist who spent 3 months in Palestine in 2019. Saida, good to have you as well, part of this broadcast. Assalamu alaikum and welcome, Saida.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Indeed. Thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, with that kind of umbrella or that kind of cloud of load shedding lingering over you, so we're not sure whether we'd keep you or have you for much longer. But I have with me, Sarah, I just want to put one question to you. I have a tweet posted not too long ago by Dr. Sheikh Omar Suleiman, a famous scholar in the United States, who says that attach yourself to the oppressed in a way that when their cause is mentioned, a face comes to your mind. One story deeply embedded in your conscience is far more potent than a bunch of statistics and hashtags. And I want to ask you, based on that type of thought, that one is you're trying to convince somebody, you're trying to educate somebody in South Africa about the nature of apartheid in Palestine, and the other is the potent power that comes through a narrative of a personal experience that you as a South African have in the occupied Palestinian territories. If you were to be asked, how would you use an incident or your experiences in Palestine to convey to a South African what exactly is the reality of apartheid in Palestine?
Yes, thank you. I would just like to start this off with the fact that I had the privilege and opportunity to serve as an EA, which means ecumenical accompaniment activist, on the ground in Palestine from 3 August to 3 November 2019. So we were the second last group who was allowed in by the Zionist regime before the COVID-19 lockdown in Israel. So EAPI is an ecumenical accompaniment program for Palestine and Israel. It's also an initiative of the WCC, World Council of Churches, which is based in Geneva. And under the ecumenical program to end the illegal occupation of Palestine, it is also a Christian organization that intentionally works with people of all faiths and faith. And it was established in 2002 in response to Israeli violence following the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the year 2000, and also to find justice. So when I arrived in East Jerusalem, we were 17 international teams of activists, and our group was sent to South Hebron Hills, which is located in the far south of the so-called West Bank. Now, when I say so-called, I would like to clarify that, you know, when I lived through apartheid, and as a family, we experienced quite a bit. But coming to Palestine, or the West Bank, so-called West Bank, I was totally shocked and numb. I had never, ever in my life experienced something similar to what the Palestinians are going through at the moment. When I say so-called West Bank, I mean, we went through so many checkpoints. I mean, most of the villages are surrounded by checkpoints, military checkpoints, flight checkpoints. Even the enclave that we had our placement in where we live, which is called Yatzai, it's quite a big town, but of about 300,000 residents. But it has the infrastructure of a little town of probably like 50,000 people. But going through all those checkpoints and to see the way the West Bank has been, you know, in little enclaves, and all surrounded by checkpoints, military checkpoints, flying checkpoints. I mean, there's virtually no West Bank, and that was shocking to me. We also know that Palestine, so-called Palestine, is in the West Bank are divided in certain areas like Area A, Area B, and Area C. The Area A is under the jurisdiction and control of the Palestinian Authority. B is a joint venture of the Palestinian Authority and the Israel. And C, which forms 60% of the West Bank, is under total civil, economic, religious, and military control of the Israeli regime. And you can just imagine the atrocities that are taking place on a daily basis. So they can, ordinarily, like one of the speakers said before, an 18-year-old can declare a Palestinian as illegal or as illegal. So from the outset, we witnessed so many atrocities. I mean, if you compare to the part of South Africa, then I think, you know, it's just something so racist. It's something so evil. From the outset, we witnessed countless demolitions. I think that the saddest thing for me was to witness on a daily basis, because we were on the ground from the morning right till the evening. I witnessed a demolition of homes this one particular day with a family in there. And it was so which is something I prefer such signs. I have never seen, men crying, but I've witnessed that. Also, the fact that when they come with their bulldozers to demolish a home, first of all, you get the soldiers going in, taking most of the gold, shekels, the money within the home, and then they would put demolish the home with furniture, with clothing, and everything. Anyone intervenes, especially the Palestinian family, they either arrested or they shot. I mean, we were there to witness children going to school, being attacked by settlers. A lot of our EA activists were beaten up in the interview. So our tasks were mainly to witness, to do reports for UNICEF, for the United Nations, and for all the international organizations that could, pressurize the Israeli government to stop. Systems, water systems, electrical equipment, any water resources are destroyed on a daily basis. Pay for the Palestinians, of the Bedouin Palestinians, are bombed. Water wells that date back to the Roman era are bombed. So people are not allowed to live, how to live as a nation.
Sorry, but we just stop you there for a bit. We're just having a bit of interference on that line that is making it a bit
I can't hear you.
follow everything that you're saying. So we'll try to reestablish that line. In the meanwhile, let's go back to Fatima and take this discussion a bit forward as we enter the last few minutes of the discussion. And Fatima, I want to ask you, as the international solidarity movement, the ecumenical accompaniment program, the various initiatives, eyewitnesses in the ground from around the world, the powerful stories that have come out of that through eyewitness accounts, the blogging that took place through the Intifada, the video footage that was captured at a time when social media was not so strong. What role did that kind of solidarity, human to human contact, eyewitness accounts play in the forging of a cohesive solidarity movement, the success of BDS and everything that we've seen in these last 2 decades? Okay. Fatima, are you there?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes. Did you get my question?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, in terms of the International Women's Peace Service and all the other solidarity movements that have been based in the West Bank, there are still, some of them are still based there. They definitely got the message out in terms of what the experiences of the lived experiences of occupation are all about. The significant part of these organizations is that yes, they witnessed and they actually sent out the message. And this is in contrast to the media. And I experienced this myself many times on the West Bank. Media take the cue from Israeli spokesperson. So very few of them ever came onto the West Bank or experienced anything. So they would, the world news as such that they get from occupied Palestine comes through the media. Since I've been there, and now that Al Jazeera is there, and a few others are there. There are a few more media houses that are much more powerful and speaking the word. But at that time, definitely, it was the international movement that actually brought out the message and started putting out the basis for why BDS should be applied against the apartheid state. So definitely, exactly as you said, they have provided the impetus for that. And I believe, when somebody asked me, and I was going through a very depressing time because of so many of the horrible things that was happening in the West Bank, and I said, but it feels like I'm doing nothing. And this activist wrote back to me and said, like, no, all these little hits you feel like it's hitting your pinhead. And at some point, your stories actually will be like at that time we were going through the end of the Truth and Reconciliation for whatever it was worth at that time. And these stories that came out of the international movements will also in future provide some kind of documented reality, the reality of the Palestinians and what they've experienced on the ground. So there's many different facets to being an international activist within these situations. It's the witnessing, it's about writing about it, it's about talking about it, it's about making sure you get it out. And yeah, exactly. Social media wasn't as big when I started in 2003. By 2007, there was Facebook happening. I mean, besides the politics of ownership and who they are and what they are about and how they align themselves with Zionism. Besides that, social media has been taken the message much further than we had at that time. And yeah, I think definitely international movements have to be there. I mean, we played a significant role in terms also of making sure there was a physical presence. At that time, that had much more significant hold of internationals intervening in terms of what was happening on the ground. And the fact that we made the soldiers feel, realize that they're actually being observed, that they're not acting in a vacuum. At some point, it did actually lose its power, and it's more the Jewish or the Jewish organizations that were on the ground that were actually being heard by the soldiers. But it's all these sort of things, and yes, there have to be many facets to the sort of the international solidarity movement, and these are different ways that you can actually get the message out there. The message is there, and with social media now and alternative media having much more face than it had at that time, you can, and many people actually do have a much better picture of what's happening on the ground. Yeah, and Iskandar is being much more hopeful than I am. Inshallah, inshallah, somewhere in our lifetime we will see some of that coming to an end. So yeah, and he can also speak more to about what he knows about international solidarity movements. Yeah.
The evolution is that has occurred since those years that I've spoken about through our personal experience, and we know the early 2000s extremely tumultuous. We see the fruits of Oslo being reaped, great frustration amongst Palestinians with the occupation as well as the failures of their own leadership. We see the second Intifada, the major provocation that took place at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, serious violations, the reoccupation of the West Bank, the beginning of the building of the Israeli apartheid wall. So a series of developments at that stage, coupled with the role of international solidarity, now builds up this international movement. And South Africa played a key role in that. If we look at a key point in this being the World Conference Against Racism that took place in Durban in the year 2001, how that catapults this concept of Israel being an apartheid state to the fore. Thereafter, not many years later, the establishment of BDS and organic coal within Palestine. Talk to us about how international solidarity, the role of South Africa has played in the evolution of the ideas and the resistance to apartheid in Palestine. Where did it start? Where is it now? And where is there room for improvement in your view?
Are you asking me? Brian?
Yes, I will come back to you, Fatima, in a bit. I just want to hear from Iskandar on that point, and I'll come back to you in a bit.
Sure, Ibrahim. So, I mean, inevitably, I think to an extent, politics are personal. And politics are not only personal. Politics are beyond myself, yourself, individuals. We must have larger formations, movements, even the power to govern. But in terms of my own journey, Ibrahim, I mean, I've been through a number of things that's actually kind of a result of an international solidarity, I guess. but I actually, I didn't grow up knowing I was Palestinian. I grew up knowing that I was Arab, knowing that my father's family came from Lebanon. My mom's side is not Arab. She comes from a white American family. And I was primarily raised by her as a single working class mother. It was only when I was 16 where I was able to start questioning, my rationale was, my akal was developing. That I was looking at maps and I saw Palestine, and I always knew that my grandfather was from Jerusalem. And then I said, wait, hold on, Jerusalem, but that's not Lebanon, that's Palestine. And I was actually in the car with my mom going to the grocery store, and I turned to her and I said, Mom, am I Palestinian? She looks at me, yeah. So from there, I began a process. Eventually, when I got to university, like many people, we become conscientized when we encounter more knowledge. And I kind of threw myself into Palestine solidarity, primarily through student movements, the Students for Justice in Palestine movement, of which I co-founded a chapter at my undergraduate university in Los Angeles. I joined another chapter while I was doing some postgraduate work in Boston. And I was also on the national steering committee of the nationwide Students for Justice in Palestine. And even at that time, as I was planning to come to South Africa, we had a commitment to internationalism, whether it was the various, what we might call nationalist struggles within the United States, right? The Black struggle, the indigenous struggle, or struggles in many other places of oppressed peoples and nations, including here in South Africa. We invited a member at that time of what was called BDS South Africa, which is now called Africa for Palestine, an organization that I've been a volunteer and activist with since I've come to South Africa. And I'm a very proud activist with Africa for Palestine. Our struggle was inherently international. How do you talk about Palestine from the United States without being internationalist and seeing the connections? When I came to South Africa, I saw another shade of internationalism. South Africa is a wonderful place, generally speaking, for I think for leftists and for Muslims. When you come here, there's just a different feeling. We can kind of critique what's happened post 94, and we should, and there's many inadequacies, but there are some good things that have happened in the post-94 reality that creates a space that's a bit different. And it's kind of tough when you're from someplace and you don't see comparatively other contexts. But the South African context is even more inherently internationalist. Because in theory, you have support of internationalism from the level of state to civil society to the common sense of the am, of individuals. I can't tell you what it's like to drive through Cape Town and see Palestinian flags in the Cape Flats. That's, mashallah, that's an amazing experience. So I think South Africans have a lot to teach the world, whether it was in the past or now, about internationalism. South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle is one of the most recent kind of massive movements that embodied an internationalist component. Of course, there was the on-the-ground struggle, the movements on the ground, whether violent or non-violent, militant or kind of more peaceful. And then you have the international call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against apartheid South Africa, in which countries all across the world listened to what South Africans needed and wanted. So in terms of how South Africans have answered that call for the Palestinian cause, as the Palestinians learn from South Africa how to create this dynamic of the internal struggle and the external support. Okay, that's not to say, there was always internationalism in the Palestinian struggle too. Whether it was under the British or 48, there was a war, not only between the burgeoning Palestinian nationalist movement, but the Arab states around who saw this land as not just Palestinian, but Arab and Islamic land and Arab Christian land. And we can even say the Arab Jews, this is their indigenous home. Of course, Zionism hijacked Judaism from Arab Jews. Um, but in South Africa, it's been very, very interesting to see the navigation of being committed to struggles now in the moment inside South Africa, but realizing that actually South Africa has a very special and important role to play in the struggle against Israeli apartheid. Um, whatever you want to say, when something happens in South Africa, whether it's at the movement or the state level, that reverberates across the world. And it still carries a type of ethical and moral authority that really kind of no other country has. So I think it's of the wajibat. You'll have to ask a Maulana. I mean, if this is fard or not, but it's of the wajibat for Muslims or other people to be engaging in the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement as a bare minimum in South Africa. Not only because it's what's right as Muslims or otherwise, but because literally your voice here carries and reverberates in ways you cannot see. And I don't know of any other global South context in which, I mean, the strength of the solidarity movement has such an effect. Of course, South Africa is also unique in that the Zionists are very strong here. They may not be able to be formally and overtly in your face because of the traditional solidarity between those in power with Palestine. But comparatively to the United States, which everyone thinks is the qibla of Zionism, I've heard before that per capita, I mean, in terms of kind of the strength of Zionist communities, whether it's implicit or explicit, I mean, their wealth here is actually greater than in the United States and their power. So you do have serious forces here that also create more of a battle. And inevitably, we must fight. And we must have a battle, whether it's in the streets of Johannesburg, Cape Town, New York City, Paris, Kashmir. That battle needs to continuously take place until apartheid is destroyed in Israel. So I fully encourage, whether you're joining an organization like Africa for Palestine or the Palestine Solidarity Committee or many other coalitions organized around BDS, your involvement in that may seem small to you, but it has a massive impact that is undeniably contributing to the cause of freedom for Palestinians.
Let's get a final word as we're almost out of time from Fatima Gabru, who, as I mentioned earlier, spent a number of days and a number of weeks in Palestine in the early 2000s, also founding activist for the UJ Palestine Solidarity Forum. Fatima, as a conclusion, as we look and obviously appreciate the power of the South African voice when it comes to Palestine, whether it's the words of Nelson Mandela, the words of Desmond Tutu, whether it's the experience of apartheid in South Africa and how that the parallels that have been drawn, how it is the voice of organized solidarity in South Africa, or the voice of the government that is respected in Palestine, and so forth. And the important role that South Africa has played in all those milestones that I described a bit earlier. What is your opinion on the state of South African solidarity with Palestine on this occasion of Israeli Apartheid Week? What have we done correctly, and where can we improve? All right, it seems okay. I see we might be having yes, I have you on right now. My final question, just in a minute or two to wrap up. Looking at how your experience and the experiences of your generation of activists has been able to shape the solidarity movement in South Africa, yourself being founders of the likes of the Palestinian associations or the Palestinian alliances or committees. We saw a blossoming of those all over South Africa during those early 2000s. It's obviously come 20 years later. We've seen important roles being played, a growth of those movements, but also challenges plaguing those movements. Your appraisal of the state of solidarity in South Africa and what can be done, in the next phase.
In terms of the activists doing their work and approaching government, they are doing quite a bit of work. I just feel that the government itself is a bit disingenuous when they come to they speak on Palestine. So that has a lot of work to do. There's a strong Zionist lobby within the South African government as well that has to be counted. So yeah, activists are doing the work. They're going there. They're representing the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and their work must continue. The South African government itself needs to be woken up. They need to recognize the injustices of the Palestinian people, how much it borders in terms of our own experience and our own history.
Thank you so much. I thank all our guests for joining us for the special symposium, this forum this evening. South African eyewitnesses to Israeli apartheid. Iskandar Abbasi is a Palestinian raised in the United States of America, living in South Africa now for a couple of years in his studies, and giving us a perspective of a Palestinian, the reawakening of his identity, being involved in the international struggle in the United States, and how the South African experience has enhanced his understanding as well as solidarity against Israeli apartheid. Fatima Gabru, founding member of the University of Johannesburg Palestine Solidarity Forum, as well as Saida Essop joining us there shortly with her experiences as a South African observer in Palestine. From myself, Ibrahim Musa of the Palestine Solidarity movement, and obviously the Palestine Information Network, as well as all who have joined us for the special broadcast on Salam Media. Keep the discussions going on Israeli Apartheid Week with the hashtag United Against Racism, United Against Racism, also Israeli Apartheid Week, and IAW 2021. Till we meet again, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries,